Thank you very much for your kind attendance. Thank you very much, everyone, for your attendance to the fourth webinar in the clinical research in neurorehabilitation. This is a series organized by WFNR. I'm Caterina Pistarini. I am the General Secretary of WFNR. And the argument, the topic of this webinar is sample size calculation, randomization, and outcome measure. Today, we have a lecture of Professor Natasha Lannin. Professor Natasha Lannin is a clinical trialist with an intensive research track record in neurorehabilitation and neurological disease and brain injury. She worked in the Department of Clinical Neuroscience at Monash University in Australia, and she conducted randomized trial investigating the effect of rehabilitation intervention in stroke and brain injury patients. The topic of her talk is measuring outcome within neurorehabilitation trials. At the end of the presentation, we can present your question on chat. Thank you very much, Professor Natasha Lannin. Welcome to be here today, and I leave the floor to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Christian, you'll play the presentation first, I think, and then we'll do questions.
Yes, thank you much for the kind invitation to speak today. I'm going to be presenting a webinar on measuring outcomes in neurorehabilitation trials. I begin today by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which I'm recording my presentation today, and I pay my respects to their elders past and present. I wish to acknowledge that I receive a research fellowship from the Heart Foundation of Australia and that I have no further disclosures relating to any of the content that I'm going to be presenting today. I will be using my own trials as examples, but the content is all in the public domain. Selecting an outcome measure is a critical first step in designing a valid and clinically useful trial. Evaluating the outcome is the primary means by which two different rehab interventions can be compared with regards to effectiveness. In neuro-rehab trials to date, the importance of outcome measure selection has probably not received sufficient attention, or when it has, it's been focused primarily on psychometric properties. Today I'm going to be discussing some of these additional factors, such as how can we determine which tool we should use and what are core outcome sets. For instance, how do we think about what matters most to people with lived experience, as well as the clinicians who are going to deliver our interventions. I'm going to start by clarifying what I call basic assumptions. It's what all of the textbooks in stats will tell you. I have no doubt I'm just going to be talking through some things that you already know. I do want to note that my experience is in effectiveness trials, which is where we seek to determine the effects of an intervention as it's typically administered. Effectiveness trials, or pragmatic trials as they're also known, tell us about the actual effects in clinical practice. But these differ from efficacy trials or explanatory trials, which are going to be focused on selecting outcomes to measure a very precise, defined intervention administered under ideal conditions. And efficacy trialists are also usually interested in the why. And so explanatory or efficacy trials will often have biological measures as well as behavioural measures. The other factors that I wanted to touch on is that an acknowledgement that clinical trials will collect multiple outcomes. They're going to collect data that is to do with describing the patient population. They're going to collect data that's to do with the process of the trial so that we can understand things like fidelity. But what we're going to be talking about today are outcomes. And that's where we're trying to determine the differences between two or more groups. These might be primary or secondary outcomes, and I'll touch on that in a moment. Outcomes can also be surrogates, and it's really important that we remember that. We might not be able to measure at the actual level that we need to. For instance, I have never measured in humans at the level of muscle biopsies for determining contracture. I have always measured a proxy for that, a surrogate measure, which is torque-controlled passive range of movement. The other thing to say is that trialists need to measure all participants, so both groups, with identical rigour, follow up everybody and make sure you get the same data on everyone. And I also want to acknowledge, as you will hear in the presentation on sample size, that outcome selection does influence power, so selecting the right outcome can really influence the results of your trial. Okay, so linking your outcomes to your research question, this is probably the most important thing. Clinical trials should answer important questions. Of course, importance is always a matter of perspective. The research questions that I think are important might not be important to others. But in my mind, important trials are those that resolve clinical dilemmas. They change clinical practice. And so ultimately, they improve the quality of life for people who need neuro rehab. So one of the first steps to do when you're planning your trial is to make sure your trial addresses an issue of clinical importance, and this should then help drive your outcome measurement tool. There are, of course, other things to consider, and we'll chat through some of those in a moment, but your trial's objectives can be summarised by its PICO. Your trial should be designed to explicitly investigate the effect of an intervention compared to a comparator on an outcome of a particular interest to a population of people. So when you're first beginning to plan your study and writing out your PICO, I've no doubt that you're going to write down an outcome that you believe to be most relevant in broad terms, might be participation, for example. But before you can use that outcome as in your trial, you're going to have to operationalise it, and that will help you select an appropriate outcome measurement tool. I've personally found the most efficient way to do this to create a well-specified causal model of my intervention process that's being tested. It helps me define why I think my intervention is going to have the effect on the population that I think it is. Like all other aspects of designing a trial, though, being super clear about your research question is going to help guide you with selecting the right outcome measurement tool. So how do I map my PICO and think about my outcome measurement tool? Well, you're first going to probably have to think about your construct and then think about your indicator of that construct before worrying too much about the measurement tool that you use. By this, what I mean, and if I use one of my own trial examples here, and this was a trial to test the effectiveness of additional therapy after Botox injections. It's called the INTENSE trial, published in Stroke. The construct I was interested in testing was improvement in upper limb function. So realistically, when we developed our theory of change model for the trial, we acknowledged that we would have a range of different people attending our spasticity clinic for whom the intervention might be appropriate, and we were wanting to make sure the indicator we selected didn't have a bias towards one or only one end of the group, one spectrum of that group. And so we had some challenges with selecting an indicator, but what we did think was that if the intervention was going to be considered to be effective, then people should be able to use their hand in a functional activity, perhaps just a task-based activity, but we also acknowledged it had to be one that measured at the performance level, so it wasn't going to be an observational measure. In this case, we selected the indicator of dexterity, although it's probably functional movement of blocks, and the outcome measurement tool that we chose was the box and block test. And so the data we collected was number of blocks per minute measured using the box and block test, which gave us ratio data. One of the common misunderstandings that novice trialists or readers hold about outcome measures is that you power on a primary outcome, but everything else that you're interested in, you just measure anyway and it becomes a secondary outcome. This isn't great trial practice. Yes, once you've determined your construct of interest and you select an indicator that helps you know how did my intervention make a difference, and then you power on that indicator, that is your primary outcome. But please know there should be a relationship between any secondary outcome measures that you choose to include. They should relate back to the primary outcome conceptually and relate to each other potentially, but definitely relate back to your construct. As an example, I'm going to run back through the intense intervention and by testing whether our intense intervention led to recovery of arm function after stroke, we had selected our primary outcome measure of the box and block test, and we were testing that at 3 months. But the secondary outcomes were still related to this primary outcome. There is good data to show that strength may be a precursor to hand function, and so we measured grip strength. Qualitative research had suggested to us a concern from people who live with upper limb spasticity and a movement disorder is that they don't want to be reliant on caregivers for hand cleanliness, so we had a secondary outcome of caregiver burden. And because all of these constructs influence health-related quality of life, we also collected EQ5D on the trial. So you can see hopefully from this that all of the outcomes, secondary and primary, relate back to recovery of arm function. As well as selecting the outcomes that link back to your construct of interest, you should also consider if the outcomes of your construct are the ones that matter most to the people who matter most. First, an outcome measure which is of clinical relevance. Now, here I tend to declare an interest in this discussion in that I'm a clinician researcher, and so I do have a strong connection to and a belief in the importance of selecting the outcome areas of greatest relevance to the clinicians who are going to be delivering your intervention in clinical practice. Consider what outcomes will matter to the clinician. For effectiveness trials in upper limb rehab, for example, as a therapist, I'm really interested in improving functional movement, and I'm far more interested in that than the results of, say, functional MRI. And the second group that I'm really interested in ensuring that we measure at the outcome level, that what we measure at the outcome level is what they think matters, are the people who are going to receive your interventions, so the clients themselves. In the flowchart that I've just put up there, you can see that there's an evolution to selecting a PRO. Absolutely, you can just Google them. There are literally thousands of them out there. But it is of critical importance that we ensure that we test our interventions against the outcomes that matter to our population. To ensure that these outcomes are meaningful to our population, we should first draw on important qualitative data to understand what concepts link to the perceptions of improvement from their perspective. But more than that, and hopefully you can see this in the work from Dua, researchers still need to do the work between that qualitative information and linking it back to, in our case in neuro rehab, ICF codes. And so this is so that we can ensure that the measurement constructs, so the measurement concepts that are raised by the participants, the people with lived experience, are linked back to measurement constructs in the ICF. And then that can help us identify measurement tools that have good psychometric properties and are considered to be clinically relevant, etc. So that linkage work we need to do from the patient's life story, their perspectives back to ICF and then forwards into our trial is, I think, the piece that we sometimes skip. And now I want to touch on psychometric properties. In selecting your outcome measurement tool, we should of course do so with an understanding of the outcome measurement tool's psychometric properties. But before we get started on the psychometric properties of the tool, I do want to make the point that measurement issues are common in clinical trials. And that human or device error can lead to erroneous values being recorded. So a tip from me is to ensure that you plan for them so you can hopefully avoid them. But ultimately, the goal of measurement in clinical trials is to collect data that has high validity so that we are measuring what we think we're measuring, and to ensure that we can scale up. Or for those of you who are not randomising, we also need to have high reliability. Starting first with validity, and the key question to ask yourself is, how well does the indicator map to the outcome? Can I get an unbiased, accurate measurement of the outcome that I think by using this measurement tool? We also, though, need to think about whether the data that you collect on this tool will vary over time on its own, nothing to do with your intervention. Is there a published agreement from people that this measurement tool addresses what you think it does, that it will show change on your indicator, and that your indicator is aligned to your construct? This is why I say that validity of your outcome measurement tool is the most important psychometric property. And even though I personally think, just because of the features of a randomised control trial, that reliability of the tool is less important, it is really critical when we come to translating our trial findings into clinical practice. And so reliability is about measuring your indicator precisely. And the key question we should ask ourselves is, does it give me a precise measure, or is there a lot of noise? And from this and the webinar on sample size, you'll really start to understand that the reliability of your tool can also impact on how many participants you're going to need to recruit for your trial. And last but not least for clinical trials is ensuring that you select a tool that is sensitive, specific and responsive. Remember though, all of these measurement properties, validity, reliability, sensitivity, specificity, responsiveness, will differ with the features of your population. Things such as severity of symptoms, timing of outcome measures, things like how long you want to measure outcomes for. Psychometrics of a tool are not static, and so it's important to understand the quality of your measurement tool when used ideally in the same way that you intend. The good news is that these days we don't always have to do all the hard work when examining psychometric properties. There are two things that can help us. The first being systematic reviews of measurement tools, like the one that I've just popped up there. It's a paper we published on activity performance tools for adults with spasticity. The second helpful invention though that we have are core outcome sets. Core outcome sets have been established across rehabilitation with a number in neuro rehab so that we can increase our consistency across trials, ultimately so we can run better systematic reviews. The truth is though that by following a core outcome set, you're also much more likely to measure appropriate outcomes and likely too to reduce selective reporting. If you haven't heard of core outcome sets before, then I suggest you follow up with the COMET initiative, which was established about a decade ago to raise awareness of the current problems that we have with outcomes in clinical trials and to encourage core set development and use. They have a really strong public and patient involvement too in their core set development, which is an added bonus. What I like is that they now have the COMET database, which I'm showing up on the slide, and you can search for the core data sets in your area. COMET is completely free and it's really well worth checking out if you aren't familiar with it. Okay, in our trials, we're also going to need to think about how we will measure a construct. Three major sources of information could be considered. First, the outcome of interest might be a participant's capability to perform a specific behaviour under conditions, and in this case, you're going to need a performance-based measure of your behaviour of interest. A second possibility, though, is that you might be interested in a person's typical performance in daily context as perceived by them themselves. And in this situation, you would want to administer a self-report or a patient-reported outcome or PRO measure. And finally, the outcome of interest may be the person's typical performance, but you might want to hear the perspective of another party, such as a caregiver or a therapist. Each of these conditions has things that you will need to balance, and there's no right or wrong answer here. If you're delivering an intervention, say a mobility intervention, you might be tempted to measure walking speed, which is a performance-based measure, and that might be perfectly fine and well mapped back to your construct. However, what if I was to say that your intervention was delivered not to understand one-off mobility, but rather your intervention was hypothesised to change whether or not somebody got out of the house as often as they wanted. So in this case, you might want to consider measuring somebody's daily walking data over a month using a patient-reported outcome. Or perhaps your intervention is delivered to reduce caregiver burden on a task such as hoisting. You're going to teach a whole group of patients to do a step around transfer and hopefully remove the need for home-based hoist in the bathrooms. So in this instance, perhaps you need to consider the caregiver burden of mobility support instead as your primary outcome. So hopefully what you can see is that the decisions you will make regarding the outcome areas and the ultimate tools that you select will need to link back to your research question. There's no right or wrong about which source and type of information you collect, but they do need to link back to your research question. The final point I wanted to raise is that it's key to also think about the temporal considerations in outcome selection. The selection of one or more assessment points has to include considering the measurement issues so that you avoid a mismatch between your study plan and the capacities of your outcome measurement tool. As I mentioned earlier, the researcher needs to be sure that the measurement tool selected is responsive over the period of time that you have selected between the delivery of the intervention and the measurement of outcomes. You'll likely draw on other studies as well as listen to qualitative data being shared with you in order to make this decision. For instance, in one of my trials, we considered that it might take longer for someone to return to community-based activities post-discharge than home-based activities. So in our home rehab trial, we measure at 4 weeks post-discharge for ADL performance and again at 3 months. And at that 3-month time point, we're expecting to see greater community participation. Another point to consider is the trajectory of change in your population. If we recruit people early after a neurological insult, then we have to expect that some will return to greater function spontaneous. There is recovery that occurs. The opposite can also happen too, of course, and if you're doing trials which includes people with degenerative diseases, this is quite obvious, but it is important for us to remember that there is a natural recovery as well as disease progression going on in the background. I also wanted to let you know I appreciate that all trials run to a budget, so we can't simply collect all long-term data without significant investment. And so again, there's going to likely be a need for you to think about the time timing of your trial with respect to the budget. But we should also think about that because we need to account for potential participant burden. In some groups, frequent measurement is accepted, in other groups it is not. So it's really important that you think about the burden that your measurement is going to have, your protocol is going to have on the people who are going to have to live with it, and that is the participants in your trial. In summary, selecting an appropriate outcome measure is a key factor that affects the ultimate value of the results from your clinical trial. To date, probably selection of measures has focused primarily on psychometric properties. Whilst important, hopefully what you can see is that you also need to focus on the suitability of the measurement tool for its intended use based back against your research question. A good match between the measure and what you as a researcher expects to change as a result of your intervention is really needed so that you can ensure that you develop a valid picture of the outcomes. Writing out a causal model of your intervention can really help do this. And finally, please remember that different measurement tools may capture different aspects of complex phenomenon, and neurorehabilitation is complex. Not all measures, though, will be equally valid for all people. Be clear about your population, the timing for data collection, and how your outcome relates to your research question. These factors are key. Thanks so much for your time.
Thank you very much, Professor Lannin. We can share if we have no specific question in the chat. I have a question, if it is possible for you.
Yes, please.
An observation, in particular, the time selection to verify the tool of rehabilitation. Because rehabilitation is a long process that lasts for many months, years. Then when you select the time point to verify our goal, this is a selection that depends from type of patient, for the expected improvement, for the basis on literature, on the basis of literature, or what is the time. Because as you mentioned at the beginning of your presentation, the design of the study is very important when we start with work on rehabilitation. The sample size, the objective, and the measurement for outcome. And I ask to you if you have something, some words about this.
Thank you. Very good question. It is a balancing act, and there is no right or wrong answer to this. You're quite right. Rehabilitation, in some conditions, neurorehabilitation is lifelong, and a trial can often not go for a long period of time. It often can't go for a long period of time because we lose patients through dropout. They move away, they die, or they just become uninterested. And so the longer your follow-up period is, the timing of your final assessment, usually the greater your power. You need to have a bigger sample size to accommodate dropouts. And so often we find ourselves thinking, gosh, should I measure the effect at 3 months? Should I measure it at 12 months? Should I measure it at 3 years? There isn't any right or wrong answer. What I would say is, if you do a theory of change, a model of the reasons why you think your intervention will be effective, that can usually help. For me, for instance, when I planned out, I'm doing a return to work trial at the moment for people who've survived stroke, and we're working at the time of their stroke. And in that, when we thought about our theory of change, we were intervening very early after stroke with this more milder stroke population. We thought about, on the background of current COVID and a lot of job losses, people were going to be keen to get back to work. We expected they would be likely, if this 12-week intervention was going to work, we would probably see change by 3 months to 6 months. So we've put in that end of treatment measure at 3 months, and we're following up again at 6 months with this population. Would I like to follow up longer? Of course. I'd love to know what's happening to these people in 12 months' time and 5 years' time. But unfortunately, we didn't get funded enough money to do 4 time points. So we had to choose just to follow the follow-ups for 2. So I really would recommend for people who are thinking, what time point should I choose? Think about why you think your intervention will work. How will you know it has worked, and therefore that will give you an indication about when you might need to measure. Look at the literature. For instance, the people who might be interested or doing contracture management trials, which are some of the trials I've done. We know that the immediate effects of casting and splinting, for instance, has a different result if you leave it 24 hours after you've removed the plaster cast before you measure passive range of movement, and therefore get a proxy indicator for contracture. So the literature tells us too that when we remove the cast, we have to wait 24 hours before we take the range of movement measure. So there'll be some of that sort of biological literature we should take into account. And then, as you suggest, I think really looking at what other trials have done and asking patients and families what matters most. Okay. I once did qualitative interviews with people who were getting back to work after brain injury, and one of the participants said to me, "Oh, don't ask me if I got back to work. Ask me a year afterwards if I've still got the job." So that really made me think about what's the most important thing for the patient, and then the timing of asking that. If he's right and he can get a job but can't sustain employment for 12 months, then obviously that helps suggest to us that time period we should be measuring for that outcome of have I got sustained employment should be more like 12 months, 2 years, or 3 years after our rehab program has finished. So I do think it's about what your goal of your intervention is, and also what you're interested in finding out. And it's a balance, because the longer you have to follow people up for, the more dropouts you're likely to have. So the more people you're going to need in your trial to get power, to maintain power.
Thank you. I have a question on chat from Adamu Ahmad. How do I measure patient-reported outcome? This is a question.
Yeah, great question. Different patient-reported outcomes are measured in different ways. There are some, like health-related quality of life. Take the EQ5D, for example, and that's quite commonly used in neuro rehab trials. We often use it because it has a proxy version, which has been shown to be give consistent reports to self-reported. That's a survey, but they've also validated that for telephone interviews, and they've validated that for self-filling in on an app. So it really depends on the different measure. The point about patient-reported outcomes is that we ask them their perception, and even if we disagree as a clinician, then we're going to take their scores. And this is often really hard to do. I know that as an occupational therapist by background, sometimes I'll ask a patient-reported outcome like the EQ5D and about everyday activity, and that's one of the domains of the EQ5D. And people will say that they have no problems at all walking, for example, and I'll think, I think you do have problems with walking, and you want to change it, but you can't with a patient-reported outcome. It's got to be their score. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor Lanning. Thank you very much for your presence, for your very well lecture. Unfortunately, Professor Hill is not here for the second lecture. He has abrupt personal event, and we can't arrange the lecture in the next time. Thank you very much for your presence today.
Thank you so much for having us.